What's up, guys? Josh here, and today we're going to be talking about the patterns of reality. So, first, what are these patterns of reality that Jonathan Pageau, Jordan Peterson, and Carl Jung speak of so much, and specifically in the clips and interviews we're about to dive into? These patterns, these archetypal patterns, you could call them, symbolic patterns, Pageau likes to call them, these are metaphysical patterns that encompass multiple realms of reality.
We are born into a pattern. We are a pattern. We are a structure that is pre-established.
What happens at the level of the individual also happens at the level of the family and scales up all the way to the society, to the nation, to the world, to the cosmos. For simplicity's sake, we'll say heaven, mind, and earth. Instead of mind, you can also say soul, right? And you could say, you can use your three-part version of the soul, excuse me, which is heart, will, mind. On the Eastern side of things, right, you can include the nous, which is something like the highest part of your soul or mind that has contact with and communicates with the divine. That's on the Christian side of things. That would be Jonathan Pageau's take, if I understand him correctly. Now, in the East, not Eastern Orthodox, but in Taoism in particular, the concept of yin and yang is very similar to the Bible's use of heaven and earth, right? Yin yang being the various opposites in reality, including order and chaos, male and female, light and dark, heaven and earth, so on and so forth. This pattern of the opposites is the most fundamental pattern of reality, right? And the pattern of the logos and the way the logos joins, draws together, and balances heaven and earth is the most important pattern of reality. And we see this in the Bible. We see this in the life of Christ. We see this in his birth. You see the joining of immortal and mortal, divinity and humanity, heaven and earth. Now, Jung, on the other hand, he typically uses less biblical terminology, but he means something very similar when he speaks of, one, the archetypal realm, which he also calls the element of spirit, the psyche, and the material world. Now, this doesn't map on to the church's structure of reality perfectly by any stretch of the imagination, right? For Jung, the psyche is a combination of physical nature and transcendent spirit or mind or nous, right? So there's a lot of overlap there. And of course, there is on the Christian side of things, or Pageau's side of things as well, and Peterson as well. But from Pageau's perspective, which he gleans from the Bible and from the early church thinkers, at the highest level, aka heaven, these patterns are the logos at the very top of the hierarchy, and the many logoi, that's just the plural of logos in the world, that are fractal reflections or representations of this logos, right? So every person has a logos, which is kind of the image of this higher identity of the logos. In this realm of heaven, or yang if you prefer, all three of these thinkers, Pageau, Jung, and Peterson, call the spiritual or metaphysical as well. Now, one step lower, right? We start with heaven and then we go one step lower and we're on the bridge. That is the mind or the soul, right? The connector of heaven and earth. Now, I prefer soul because it's more comprehensive than mind. And the soul, you could say the soul contains the mind, will, and heart. And you can also say that it includes the nous as well on the Eastern side of things, that being the highest part closest to the transcendent and what actually has the ability to commune with or communicate with divinity. Now, this psyche, the psychological realm for Jung, this is where the lifeblood that he calls the libido or psychic energy flows through the psyche and is transmuted in a sense into psychosomatic actions. This is also where the archetypes are, where the emotions are, where intuitions are had and behaviors are generated. Then at the lowest level of reality, you have earth, the realm of matter, of the physical. where we find natural laws, for example, and where the heavenly or archetypal patterns are embodied and manifested, you could say, right? Through actions, through habits, routines, rituals, right? Both individual and societal, so on and so forth. Okay. Now, keep in mind, heaven, and especially the Logos, right? The very top of the hierarchy, the Logos being the Christ, is the archetypal pattern or blueprint that informs the structure and meaning of all of existence. That's the idea from the early church's perspective, right? From Pageau's perspective here, and Jordan Peterson's as well, if I understand him correctly. And this is why I prefer the Logos over the Tao. Now, when I say I prefer the Logos over the Tao, what I mean is I prefer the modern Christian concept of the Logos over the ancient concept of the Tao. Now, if we're talking about the modern Chinese Christian concept of the Tao, they're one and the same, right? In Chinese translations of the Bible, in John, it says, in the beginning was the Tao, and the Tao was with God, and the Tao was God, right? So the Tao and the Logos are synonymous in that case. Oh yeah, but the earlier idea of what the Tao is was not an embodied God like the Christ, right? Having the Logos as a God-human blueprint that you can embody by mimicking this person, emulating this person, brings the ineffable, the unknowable down to earth, makes it as tangible and practical as it gets, right? So instead of this unknowable Tao or this Heraclitean concept of the Logos, which is really incredible but kind of all over the place, you have a person who existed in history, whose actions and teachings are recorded in the scriptures, that you can go straight to that and just do exactly as this person did. And you are embodying the Logos in that sense. So yeah, that's a brief overview of what these patterns of reality are, right? And again, the Jungian concept compared to what the Pageau brothers say about it, and the Eastern Orthodox standpoint, and even Jordan Peterson's views on this, they don't overlap perfectly. They don't map onto each other flawlessly by any stretch of the imagination, but they are very similar in many, many ways. So, yeah. Pattern recognition and mastery. Again, that is true competence. And competence, of course, brings with it success of various forms. It brings with it love, power, status, joy, peace. Patterns and symbols are everything in life. To win in any given arena in life, you need to be able to recognize the patterns in that specific arena and master them.
Archetypal themes are archetypal because they actually speak of the structure of human experience. That's why they last. So it's human nature and human experience has a pattern. You don't have the capacity to articulate that pattern as an individual, in part because your life is too short. You just can't figure it out. You know some of them in image. You think, I knew that. I knew that. I just didn't know how to say it. Your soul already knows, but it doesn't have the words. That's the Platonic idea of learning as remembering. But the ancient representations of those patterns are everywhere around you.
All right. Today we're going to talk about patterns. Surprise, surprise. We're going to watch a couple videos, a couple clips from Jordan Peterson and Carl Jung himself. But before we get to that, one thing that I think is going to help you guys a lot, if you are interested in Carl Jung, if you're interested in understanding him, Jordan Peterson, Jonathan Pageau, pattern recognition and pattern mastery is everything. Absolutely everything. No matter what metric you're talking about, right? Coming from a Nietzschean perspective of self-overcoming through the exercising of the will to power, or if you're more of a Schopenhauer guy and it's the will to life, Viktor Frankl follower, and it's the will to meaning, it doesn't matter. Whatever metric you're talking about, whatever is the pinnacle of success for you, if it's self-actualization, or if we're transcending Maslow's little hierarchy, and we're talking about something more like Jungian individuation, or if perhaps you think that there's something even higher than this mere psychological concept of individuation, and we're talking about theosis or sanctification or deification or whatever it is that you want to call it. Pattern recognition and pattern mastery are required to ascend any hierarchy of any form. Because whether we're talking about physical patterns or psychological patterns or spiritual patterns, religious patterns, psychosomatic patterns, you have to have this pattern recognition and pattern mastery for any form of competence and for any form of success in life. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and jump into these clips.
If the world manifests itself in patterns, like if we now realize that, then there's no exception, because even the breakdown of the pattern is part of the meta pattern. And that's why, like, I talk about things like the clown or the jester, or symbolism of decomposition or symbolism of death, because even the breakdown of the pattern itself is part of a bigger, let's say, call it a meta pattern. So you just can't get out of it. And so it is fun to once in a while to point to something which people will say, oh, that's just silly, that doesn't make any sense. But it's like, no, I'm sorry, there's no exception. From chewing gum to tying your shoes to everything has a pattern. And so you just can't. And so it's fun to take something that people don't expect there to be a pattern in, and to say, I'm just going to try to surprise you here and show you that just like everything else in reality, it has to, for you to see it, it has to have a pattern. And that's really the important thing that people need to understand, is that the world is too big. The world has too many things in it.
Yeah.
Every aspect of reality has a million details. Not a million, an innumerable amount of details. There's countless ways of describing something, countless ways of seeing things. And so the question is, why do we see things? Like, why are we able to engage with things? And it's because we have a capacity, consciousness, or logos, or intelligence, or whatever you want to call it. I don't even care. What's important is to understand that we have the capacity to see and to engage with patterns. And so we're able to see that even though everything has parts, right? Mm-hmm. A cup has parts, you have parts, but I can see that you have parts, but I can also see that you're one, that those parts come together and manifest a unity. And so in order for you to even see anything, there has to be a pattern. So the question is, what's the pattern?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. And yeah, maybe this is a very practical, or a very simple, and it may border on simplistic explanation of what you're getting into. But a way I've been trying to think about it is, okay, if you pulled my ID out of my wallet right now, you'd see that Adam is 32 years old and he was born in 1988. And there's a chronology to that, but it's just a fact, right? And it's a history of my life. But even the story of my life, from a birth to eventually my death, has a story arc to it. But within that story arc, it's built on this pattern of every 365 days I do a birthday party. And if at that birthday party there's not some sort of dessert and someone doesn't sing a song that's expected, it would be strange. And all of a sudden, because it would be strange, because it'd be breaking or monkeying and tinkering with the pattern, that is expected. Yeah. And that pattern of 365 is 4 seasons, right? Yeah. I have expectations, and again, it's participational. And so in some sense, it's both, like time, my time is both. There's a chronology, there's a beginning and an end, and there's some things happening in the middle, but the participational nature is patterned, right?
Yeah. And so that's you've got it right. The idea is to understand that reality is a fractal, and it has a fractal pattern, which means that the pattern of the cycle is a good way to see it. To use a cycle, let's say the cycle of the year, but within the cycle of the year, we have other cycles which actually have the same pattern, but at a smaller level. And so you have a cycle of a year, you have the cycle of the months, you have the cycle of the seasons, you have the cycle of the days, you have the cycle of the hours, of the minutes, of your heartbeat, of your breath. And so the cycles are all based on the same pattern. So if you understand breathing, for example, then you will be able to understand through analogy what the other bigger patterns are, right? That they actually have a structure.
And not just a structure to this, I hope this isn't overextending, but a life-giving a structure, right?
Yeah.
That there's life there. Yeah. Yeah.
Right, because one of the problems that we've been dealing with is that people are nihilistic, that, the kind of residues of the new atheists, there's still some around. There are fewer than there were 5 years ago, which is
they're
great.
not as militaristic or antagonistic. They're certainly friendlier than maybe 10 years ago.
They might have, I think they backed off a little bit, but it's still there, and this idea that the world is meaningless is still there in the culture. But once you realize the patterning of the world, then you actually realize the very opposite, that actually meaning is inevitable. There's no way around it. There is no meaninglessness. It's impossible. You couldn't eat, you couldn't, there's nothing you could do without meaning,
Yeah.
And so everything that you encounter has an identity, it has a purpose, it has a reason why it's showing itself to you. And sometimes it's not an important reason. Like it can be a very marginal reason, but it's still a reason, right? Our categories still have reasons for us through our lens of consciousness. And people who try to abstract themselves from this experience of consciousness, they're deluding themselves because they're doing it from within that experience. Because people will often say things like, well, it doesn't matter. It's all a bunch of quarks and it's all this. And it's like, the universe is so big. We're just a speck of dust and blah, 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 blah. And they try to do that. But it's like, okay, you can do that, but you're still doing it from the perspective of a conscious being in the world.
Yeah.
Right. You can't avoid the fact that, the sun will still come up tomorrow, and you'll probably be awake during the day, and you'll probably be sleeping at night, and you have to breathe. And if you don't breathe, you're going to die. And so those are all meaningful things.
It is the character that is doing it. There is a definite inherited complexity. You see, we are born into a pattern. We are a pattern. We are a structure that is pre-established through the genes. It is a biological order of our mental functioning. As, for instance, our biological or physiological function follows a pattern. We are only deeply unconscious of these facts because we live all by our senses and outside of ourselves. If a man could look into it himself, he would discover it. And when a man discovers it, in our days, he thinks he's crazy. And he may be crazy.
This is one of the things that I find puzzling, for example, about Dawkins, because Dawkins formulated the idea of meme, which is, by the way, the same idea as archetype. It's exactly the same idea, except he just stopped. It's like, okay, there are memes, they're selected for. Okay, selected on what basis exactly? Does that mean there's a hierarchy of memes? Are the memes more likely are the memes that are conserved more likely to be, what would you say, viable organisms? And if they're viable organisms, are they microcosms?
This is really interesting in terms of the survivability, because there's a point, I've spoken to Richard Dawkins, well, a number of times, but twice on my podcast. And the second time, somebody pointed out to me that there might be a point of agreement between you two that has been overlooked, which is that, I don't know if you've ever come across the evolutionary argument against naturalism, or the argument from reason, the idea that if you're a materialist, you can't trust your reasonable faculties. So Alvin Plantinga formulated this very well, very, very geniusly, I think, in saying that if you believe that evolution by natural selection happens materially, what does natural selection select for? Survivability. So if you're a materialist, that means that the very rational faculty that you're using right now evolved not to be sensitive to truth, but to survivability.
Yes, that's
and
right.
if that's the case, well,
definitely.
Why do you believe in the truth of evolution? Well, because you've been rationally convinced of it. But the thing that you've just assented to, the belief itself has just undercut the process by which you came to that belief.
Look, there's a whole, the New England pragmatists figured this out in like 1880.
Yeah, now I think this is a fascinating, I think it really is just a...
It is.
It's exciting. It's novel.
That's for sure. Brilliant. As far as I can tell, Dawkins doesn't know anything about the Jungian tradition of literary interpretation. And that actually, if you're going to talk about religion, that's actually a fatal flaw, right? So, And, he's called me, for example, drunk on symbols. It's like, well, the imagination is a biological function. And it has a structure and a purpose. And it has its own logos, its own intelligible order. And if you're not aware of that order, that doesn't make me drunk on symbols. It just means you don't know what you're talking about.
Now, that frustration that you appeal to there, when you hear Richard Dawkins, I think Terry Eagleton said that listening to Dawkins on theology is like listening to somebody write a book about biology whose only knowledge of the subject is having once read the Great British Book of Birds. And okay, fair enough.
But that actually turns out to be a real problem. And it's a problem with regards even to the meme idea, because you don't have to extend Dawkins' work very far to understand that religious stories are memes.
Sure.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and there's a hierarchy of memes, and some of them are very functional.
One other thing to say about patterns really quickly is these archetypal patterns, these symbolic patterns, we cannot master the highest patterns in reality without the world of religion or a metaphorical substrate or mythological landscape, right? Not pejoratively speaking. I'm not using myth as like fact and fable, but myth in the way C.S. Lewis would use the word myth. We need religious language and religious systems to properly understand, to properly recognize, understand, and master certain types of patterns. If we don't have that, if we just rely on science, one quick example, if we just rely on science, we understand what is. Science does amazing things, but we don't know what we ought to do. We don't know what we should do, right? Because science doesn't deal with the problem of value. You can't understand values and morality with just science. You need more. You need the philosophical world of religion and religious language. One quote from Carl Jung I wanted to give you really quickly here said, "Man's unconscious contains all the patterns of life and behavior inherited from his ancestors, so that every human child, prior to consciousness, is possessed of a potential system of adapted psychic functioning." Pattern recognition and mastery. Again, that is true competence. And competence, of course, brings with it success of various forms. It brings with it love, power, status, joy, peace. Patterns and symbols are everything in life. To win in any given arena in life, you need to be able to recognize the patterns in that specific arena and master them. One thing you might find interesting is the pattern of creation. We all create. Creation requires care. We talked about that last video, or at least desire, right? You want to create, but once you care about creating something, whether that's a new fly to fish with, right? A new lure, or a new reality, right? For yourself and for your family. The next stage of creation is the symbolic stage, the phase of archetypal patterns within the imagination. In other words, to build a treehouse, I need a blueprint, right? Even if that's just a mental picture or a mental image of it in my head. To tie a fly pattern properly, right? I'm a fly fisherman. I love to tie flies, my own flies, and I love to fish with them. Let's say I want to tie a popper to hunt for smallies with. Okay. I need at least a general idea of what it will look like in my imagination. I need an image, which is something, it's its essence, its identity, you could say. Its archetypal form, not in the classic Jungian sense, but archetypal in the sense that it is a universal symbol of representing the ancient Platonic form of the insect, in this case, a grasshopper or another terrestrial. So I need a number of materials, many materials, right? A multiplicity of materials, you could say. I need to pull from this realm of chaos and multiplicity the many materials of fur, rubber legs, thread, glue, etc. And I need to join that chaos with order, right? By cutting, trimming it down and putting it together to conform it to that archetypal form, the blueprint of the popper that I have in my mind, or perhaps I have it in an image on the screen. This is the pattern of creation. And I just wanted to share that with you because I think it can give you another layer of understanding of why the symbolic is so important, right? Everything is a symbol. Everything that we see, you can say in some real sense, is symbolic of its true form, right? When I look at a tree, I see a symbol of what that tree truly is. I can't see everything. I can't see its roots. I can't see inside of the tree. Uh, I only understand a very small portion of what that tree truly is. So what I see is just a symbol, a symbolic representation of what it actually is. I want to give you another archetypal sort of pattern that comes from Robert Greene's 48 Laws of Power, but also the Bible. One of the rules, or one of the laws, I think law number 5 says something like appearances matter, sometimes more than reality, right? You can gain power by being or looking competent. And this doesn't have to be Machiavellian in nature, right? The power is not inherently wrong or evil. We need some form of power to be able to provide for our families, for example. Proverbs 22:1 says, a good name is to be chosen rather than great riches, loving favor rather than silver and gold, right? So a good name, a good reputation, appearances matter. It also says in 1 Thessalonians 5:22, abstain from all appearance of evil, right? So even the very appearance of doing something evil or bad, like you want to avoid that, right? Because appearances matter. Your reputation matters. You gain power by appearing to be competent or appearing to be good. Right? Now, of course, you want to be good and you want to be competent, but the appearance is very important as well, right? What they used to say in the Marine Corps is perception is reality. It's a good quote. In some sense, it is. Another thing I wanted to bring up from the book 48 Laws of Power is pay attention to people and understand human nature, including your own. Laws 1933. Actions, so symbols and emotions and actions, they are more convincing than words, right? Words are collections of symbols, but all right. From the 48 Laws of Seduction, or however many laws it was, he says, it is massively unattractive to appear ungenerous, right? Going back to that whole appearance thing. Proverbs says, a generous person will prosper. Whoever refreshes others will be refreshed. Generosity is incredibly important. And he also says, Robert Greene, he says in the book, use flattery to reflect your target's most favorable characteristics. Proverbs 11:25 says, again, whoever refreshes others will be refreshed.